On a small farm in the fields of Bavaria, on the last night of March 1922, 6 people were murdered, an entire family, and the maid who had started work that morning. They were killed one at a time, with a mattock, in the doorway of their own barn. And then the killer did something that has disturbed investigators for 100 years. He did not leave. He stayed on the farm for days, sleeping in the house, feeding the cattle, eating the family's food, while the 6 bodies lay under the hay a few meters away. The case is called Hinterkaifeck, after the farm itself. It is the most famous unsolved murder in German history, and the details that surround it are stranger than the crime. Footprints in the snow that led to the farm and never led away. A newspaper nobody had ordered. Keys that vanished. Footsteps in the attic, heard for days by a family who kept living there anyway. Tonight, all of it, and the reason 100 years of investigation has never produced a single answer. To understand how 6 people could be killed and nobody noticed for 4 days, you have to understand what rural Bavaria was in 1922. The war had ended 4 years earlier and left the countryside poor and full of drifting men, demobilized soldiers, refugees, laborers walking between farms looking for work. Money was becoming worthless, hyperinflation was months away. Farms like this one were self-contained worlds, worked by families who saw their neighbors on Sundays and otherwise saw nobody at all. Hinterkaifeck was not a village. It was a single farmstead, a house and barn joined under one roof, standing alone in the fields between 2 small Bavarian towns, about 70 kilometers north of Munich. Its nearest neighbors were a walk away across open ground. In an age before telephones in farmhouses, that isolation mattered. Whatever happened there would not be heard. 6 people lived and died there. Andreas Gruber, 63, the farmer, by every account a hard, disagreeable man. His wife Casilia, 72. Their widowed daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35. Victoria's 2 children, Casilia, 7 years old, and Joseph, 2. And Maria Baumgartner, 44, the new maid, who arrived at Hinterkaifeck on the afternoon of March the 31st and was dead within hours of unpacking her bag. The family carried a heavy local reputation. In 1915, Andreas and his daughter Victoria had both been convicted and jailed for incest, a scandal that isolated the household further in a devoutly Catholic countryside. Victoria's husband Karl had gone to the war and been reported killed in France in 1914. When little Joseph was born in 1919, the question of who his father was became the quiet, poisonous gossip of the district. Remember that question. Half the theories in this case grow out of it. Andreas Gruber was not a man his neighbors were fond of. The accounts collected after his death describe him as miserly, quarrelsome and cold, a farmer who fought with everyone about money and boundaries, and who had, in the local phrase, no friends left to lose. It matters, because when he told people in the last week of his life that a stranger was walking around his farm at night, the reaction he got was not concern. It was a shrug. His daughter Victoria had a harder story still. She married Karl Gabriel in 1914, by every account it was not a happy match, and within months of the wedding Karl was gone to the war. In December of that year the family was told he had been killed in France. Victoria was widowed at 27, moved back into her parents' farmhouse with nowhere else to go, and there, in that house, with that father, the rest of her life took place. For 6 months before the murders, something was wrong at Hinterkaifeck, and the family told people about it. In the autumn of 1921, the previous maid walked off the farm and refused to come back. Her reason, which she repeated for the rest of her life, was that the house was haunted. She had heard footsteps and voices in the empty attic. Nobody believed her. She quit anyway. Then came the physical traces, and these are not folklore. Andreas Gruber described them to neighbors in the days before he died. He found a newspaper on the farm that no one in the household had bought or subscribed to. He found the house key missing, and could not find it again. He found a lock on the machine room broken open. And he found scratch marks on the shed door, as if someone had tried to work it loose. And a few days before the end, in fresh snow, Andreas found footprints, a single set of tracks leading out of the forest, across the field, up to the farm. He followed them. They stopped at the buildings. And there were no tracks leading back. Whoever had walked out of that forest had come to Hinterkaifeck and had not left. Andreas Gruber told at least 2 neighbors about those footprints. Neither of them took it seriously enough to do anything. There is one more detail from those final days, and of everything in this case, it is the one that stays with people. The family heard footsteps in the attic. Andreas went up with a lamp to look, more than once, and found nothing. On the last night, several accounts agree, someone in the house heard movement overhead again. They went to bed anyway. It is likely, and the investigators believe this, that a man was living in the attic of that farmhouse, above the family, for days. Watching. Waiting for something. What the maid described, she described consistently for the rest of her life. Footsteps overhead when the house was empty. Voices in the attic when everyone was accounted for downstairs. Objects moved. She was not a fanciful woman by any account, and she did not tell a ghost story to sell, she told it as a reason for walking away from paid work in a year when work was scarce. 6 months later, 6 people were dead in that house. Nobody ever asked her a second time what she had heard. So why did nobody act? Because of who was doing the telling. Andreas Gruber was disliked, and the household was tainted by scandal. The district had spent 7 years not speaking about what had happened between the farmer and his daughter. When an unpopular man says he found footprints in the snow, people nod and change the subject. The tragedy of Hinterkaifeck is not that there were no warnings. It is that every warning was given to people who had already decided not to care. Friday, March the 31st, 1922. In the afternoon, the new maid Maria Baumgartner is delivered to the farm by her sister. She has been hired to replace the maid who fled. Her sister does not go inside. She hands over the bag, says goodbye at the gate, and walks away. She is the last person outside the family to see anyone at Hinterkaifeck alive. What happened that evening was reconstructed from the positions of the bodies, and it is the coldest thing in the file. The killer did not attack the house. He waited in or near the barn, and drew the family out to him, one at a time. Something, perhaps a sound with the animals, brought them out into the dark. Andreas' wife Casilia went first, or Victoria, then the others, at intervals, each stepping through the same doorway into the same swinging blow of a mattock. 4 of them died in that barn doorway, the old farmer, his wife, his daughter, and 7-year-old Casilia. They were laid in a pile and covered, with hay, with an old door, and with a stone slab. Then the killer went into the house. In the bedroom he killed the toddler Joseph, in his cot beside his mother's bed. And in the small room off the kitchen, he killed Maria Baumgartner, the maid, who had been in that house for perhaps 6 hours and had almost certainly never seen him before. The forensic detail that ended any theory of a quick, panicked robbery, little Casilia, the 7-year-old, did not die at once. The autopsy found she had lain in the barn for some time after the attack, conscious enough to tear out tufts of her own hair, which were found clutched in her hands. Whoever did this stood in that barn, in the dark, and let it happen. Nothing that follows in this story is as difficult as that sentence. The last ordinary hours of that household can be reconstructed in fragments. The evening meal was eaten, the dishes were done. 7-year-old Casilia had been at school that day, her teacher remembered nothing unusual. The new maid unpacked her few things into the small room off the kitchen. Somewhere in the buildings, in the dark, a man was already waiting, and had been waiting, quite possibly, for several days. The medical findings were as blunt as the weapon. All 6 had died of massive blunt force injuries to the head, delivered with something heavy, bladed and swung with great force, consistent with a ruthaw, the mattock used to break up soil and roots on Bavarian farms. The blows were repeated, and they were accurate. Whoever swung that tool was strong, was used to handling it, and did not stop when the job was done. And now the part that lifts Hinterkaifeck out of ordinary murder and into legend. Over the weekend that followed, the farm was not empty. Neighbors saw smoke rising from the chimney. The cattle in the barn were fed and watered, for days, beside the bodies. Someone had eaten bread and meat in the kitchen. The family dog, found tied up in the barn, was alive. A postman delivered mail on Saturday and later said he saw nothing amiss. A coffee salesman called at the farm and left. For 3 days, a man lived in that farmhouse with 6 dead bodies under the hay. He slept there. He cooked there. He kept the animals alive, which is the detail investigators could never fit into any theory. A killer fleeing does not milk the cows. A killer covering his tracks does not feed cattle for 3 days while the corpses stiffen in the next room. This was not panic, and it was not greed. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained what it was. The weekend traffic past that farm is one of the strangest lists in criminal history. On Saturday, a postman delivered letters and noticed nothing. A coffee salesman called at the door and, getting no answer, left again. Neighbors going past saw smoke from the chimney and thought nothing of it. Of course there was smoke, people lived there. At least one person later said they saw a figure moving on the farm. None of them knocked hard enough, or long enough, to find out who was inside. And this is where Hinterkaifeck stops being an ordinary murder case. Criminologists who study it keep returning to the same problem, the 3 days. Killers who murder for money take the money and go. Killers who murder in rage flee. Killers who plan an escape do not spend 72 hours feeding livestock at the scene. Whoever this was either had nowhere else to be, or wanted to be there, living in the house of the people he had just destroyed, doing their chores. It was the small things that finally brought the neighbors. The children had not come to school. The post was piling up. Nobody had seen the family at Sunday Mass, unthinkable in that district. On Tuesday, April the 4th, a mechanic arrived to repair the engine in the machine room, worked there, and left again without seeing a soul. That afternoon, 3 neighbors walked over to Hinterkaifeck to find out what was going on. They found the barn. They found the hay, and the door, and the stone slab, and what was underneath. And then, in an act that would poison this investigation forever, they went into the house, searched it, moved through the rooms, found the bodies of the maid and the little boy, and then came back out and stood around in the yard, waiting for the police, while more and more people from the surrounding farms arrived to see for themselves. By the time the Munich police reached Hinterkaifeck the following day, the crime scene had effectively ceased to exist. Dozens of curious locals had walked through the farm. People had handled the bodies. And, the detail that makes every modern detective wince, somebody had cooked a meal in the family's kitchen and served it to the crowd. Whatever the killer had left behind of himself, in fingerprints, in footprints, in dropped possessions, it was gone before a single trained investigator arrived. What the 3 of them did next has been argued about for 100 years. Instead of sealing the barn and running for the police, they went into the house. They walked the rooms. They found the maid dead in her little chamber and the toddler dead in his cot. And then they came back out into the yard and waited, while word spread across the fields, and neighbors began arriving on foot and on bicycles to see it for themselves. The police reached Hinterkaifeck the next day, from Munich. What they inherited was not a crime scene, it was a trampled farmyard. Dozens of people had come and gone. The bodies had been moved and handled. Whatever the killer had been touched again by half the district. In an era when fingerprinting was new but real, and footprints in soft ground could still be cast in plaster, the single most valuable thing this case ever had was destroyed by people who only wanted to help, and to look. The investigation that followed was, for 1922, enormous, and almost useless. More than 100 people were questioned in the first weeks. Munich detectives, dogs, and search parties combed the fields and the forest. They found the mattock, the probable murder weapon, in the farm's own machine room. It belonged to the farm. They found no fingerprints worth having. They found no witness who had seen a stranger. And they found that nothing of value had been taken, money remained in the house, in plain sight. What they did next belongs entirely to its century. The heads of all 6 victims were removed and sent to Munich, where clairvoyants were consulted over the skulls in the hope that they might reveal the killer. It produced nothing. And it cost the case its last physical evidence. The skulls never returned to the graves, and they were lost in the chaos of the Second World War. When investigators in our own century wanted to try DNA, there was nothing left to test. The farm itself did not last either. In 1923, barely a year after the murders, the buildings at Hinterkaifeck were pulled down. During demolition, workers found the mattock's missing counterpart in the attic, confirming for many that the attic had indeed been the killer's hiding place. Today there is nothing on that ground but a field, a tree lean, and a small memorial shrine bearing 6 names. They searched the forest with dogs and with lines of men walking abreast. They dredged the pond. They checked every farm within a day's walk, every itinerant laborer, every man with a record. They followed the wandering tramp theory as far as it would go and found that no tramp had been seen, and that no tramp with any sense sleeps for 3 days in a farmhouse full of bodies rather than taking the money on the sideboard and disappearing. And so the physical case dwindled to almost nothing. The skulls never came back from Munich, they were lost during the Second World War, along with much else. The bodies had been buried without them. When investigators in the 1950s, then the 1980s, then our own century, wanted to apply new science, blood typing, then DNA, there was nothing left to apply it to. Hinterkaifeck is a case where the evidence did not merely go cold. It physically ceased to exist. What did survive is paper, statements, sketches, autopsy notes, the long lists of people questioned. Those files have been read and reread by generations of German detectives, students and writers. Every few years someone announces they have found the answer in them. Nobody has ever found anything in them that a prosecutor could take to court. So who did it? Theory number 1 has a name, and it is the name the district settled on almost immediately, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, a neighboring farmer. Schlittenbauer had been Victoria's lover. There had been a paternity dispute over little Joseph, and Schlittenbauer had at one point acknowledged the boy and paid support, while the village whispered that the real father was Victoria's own. He and Andreas Gruber had quarreled bitterly over money and over the child. And Schlittenbauer was one of the 3 men who found the bodies. His behavior that afternoon has been argued about ever since. By several accounts, he moved the bodies, pulled them out from under the hay, handled them, when a man who had found 6 murdered people might reasonably have run for the police. He explained that he was searching for his son. Others in the search party said he moved through the house as if he already knew his way in the dark. He was investigated repeatedly. He was never charged. He sued his accusers for slander, and won. The case against him is circumstantial but persistent. He knew the farm and the family intimately. He had a bitter, personal motive rooted in the child. He was among the first to enter, and he interfered with the scene in ways that struck other men present as wrong. Some witnesses said he moved through the dark house without needing a lamp. And he was, by the standards of that district, physically capable of what was done in that barn. The case for his innocence is equally real. He had an alibi for part of the night. Not one piece of physical evidence ever linked him to the weapon or the scene. The investigators of 1922, who could interview him face to face and watch him answer, did not charge him, and they wanted to charge somebody. And when the village said out loud what it thought of him, he took his accusers to court for slander, and the court found in his favor. He died in 1941 an unconvicted man, and the whispering never stopped. Theory number 2 is the one that gives this case its ghost. Victoria's husband, Carl Gabriel, was officially killed in France in 1914, but his body was never recovered, and his death rested on the word of comrades who said they had seen him die in a shell crater. In the decades after, rumors reached Bavaria, that a German prisoner of war in Soviet hands had told Russian officers he had murdered a family at a farm called Hinterkaifeck. Some believed Carl Gabriel came home from a war he had been declared dead in, found his wife with a child that could not be his, and took the farm apart. It explains things the other theories struggle with. It explains a killer who knew the farm well enough to draw the family out one by one, and to live in its attic. It explains someone who could feed the cattle without hesitation, because he had fed them before. And it explains the absence of theft. This was not a robbery, it was a household being erased. But there is no evidence for it, no confirmed sighting, no document, no confession that any investigator was ever able to trace back to a real prisoner in a real camp. It is the theory that fits the shape of the crime and nothing else. And there is a quieter version of the same idea that does not require a dead man to walk. Victoria had been declared her husband's widow, and the farm's inheritance ran through that fact. If Carl Gabriel were alive, everything about the household's legal and moral position collapsed. Motives in murder cases are usually smaller and uglier than legend allows, not vengeance from beyond the grave, but a man who needed a family to stop existing before they could say his name out loud. What kills the theory is the same thing that kills every theory here: nothing survives to test it. There is no confirmed sighting of Carl Gabriel after 1914, no photograph, no letter, no army record that contradicts his death notice. The Soviet camp story reached Germany second and third hand, decades later, and no investigator has ever traced it to a named prisoner in a named camp. It is a story about a story. It fits the crime beautifully, and it rests on nothing at all. Theory 3 is the modern one, and it is the least romantic. In 2007, students at the Bavarian Police Academy in Fürstenfeldbruck reopened Hinterkaifeck as a training exercise, applying modern criminal analysis to the surviving files. They worked through the suspects, and at the end they said they had arrived at a name, a most probable perpetrator. And then they announced that they would not release it, out of respect for the descendants of the person concerned, who are still living in the area. So the most rigorous investigation this case has ever received ended with a conclusion that exists, and is sealed. Whether that name belongs to Schlittenbauer, to a member of the family, or to someone the public has never heard of, no one outside that room can say. In 1922 the case could not be solved for lack of evidence. In our century it may have been solved, and cannot be told. This was not the first modern attempt. The case was formally reviewed again in the 1950s and reopened by Bavarian investigators in 1986, and each time the conclusion was the same: strong suspicions, no admissible proof, and every living suspect now beyond the reach of a court. By the time the tools existed to solve Hinterkaifeck, everyone who could have been charged was dead, and so was everyone who could have testified against them. Which raises the question that hangs over the whole century: would knowing even help now? There is no one to punish. The farm is gone. The victims have no living children, the family line ended in that barn. What the name would buy, if it were ever spoken, is not justice. It is only the end of a story that Germany has been unable to put down for 100 years. A century on, what is left of Hinterkaifeck is a field. The farm was demolished, the skulls were lost, the files have been re-examined until the paper is fragile. The mattock survives in a museum. And beside the road, where a lane once turned off toward a farmstead that everyone in the district avoided, there is a small white shrine with 6 names on it: a farmer, his wife, his daughter, 2 children, and a maid who had worked there for 6 hours. Here is what the evidence supports, and it is not much. Somebody knew that farm intimately. Somebody was inside it, probably in the attic, for days before the murders, leaving footprints in the snow that arrived and never departed, moving locks and keys, and being heard by a family who kept sleeping beneath him. Somebody killed 6 people with a farm tool, without taking money, and then stayed for 3 days to keep the animals alive. Everything beyond that, every name, every motive, is a theory. A century on, Hinterkaifeck has become something bigger than a case file in Germany, a permanent piece of folklore, taught in criminology courses, argued about in forums, retold in novels and films. The reason is not the body count. It is the shape of the story: a house that gave warnings for 6 months, a family that heard someone walking above their heads and went to bed anyway, and a killer who did not run. That is not a crime. That is a nightmare with a land registry number. Today the site is farmland, and the nearest town keeps the story in a small local exhibition: the mattock behind glass, the family tree on a board, the photographs of a farmstead that no longer exists. People still drive out to the field. There is nothing to see there. That, in the end, may be the most honest monument this case could have: an empty piece of ground where a house used to be, and 6 names on a white shrine beside the road. So let us stand in it one last time, on the evening the trail ends. March the 31st, 1922. The light goes out of a Bavarian sky at around 7. Inside the farmhouse, 6 people are doing ordinary things: an old couple, a widowed daughter, a 7-year-old who has school in the morning, a 2-year-old asleep in a cot, and a maid 6 hours into a new job, in a house she has been told nothing about. Above them, in an attic they have searched twice and found empty. Something moves. At some point that night, a sound in the barn, the animals unsettled, perhaps, or a voice, sends the first of them out through the yard in the dark. Then the second. Then the third, and the fourth. Nobody in the house ever raises an alarm, which tells us the ones already dead made almost no noise, and the ones still alive had no idea. And then the man walks back across the yard, into the kitchen, and puts his tool down. He stays 3 days. He eats. He sleeps in their beds. He feeds their cows, morning and evening, standing in a barn where 4 bodies lie under the hay. On the 4th day he walks away across a field, and out of the reach of every police force, court and laboratory that has come looking for him since. 100 years of investigation, and that walk across the field is still the last thing we know for certain about him. So, your verdict. Theory 1, the neighbor, Lorenz Schlittenbauer, who knew the house, quarreled over the child, and handled the bodies before the police arrived. Theory 2, the dead husband, Karl Gabriel, home from a war that had already buried him. Or Theory 3, the name a police academy arrived at in 2007 and has never spoken aloud. 1, 2, or 3, tell me in the comments. And subscribe before you go, because every story on this channel ends the same way, where the trail stops, and the questions start. At the last coordinate.